you guys all hear me okay in the back if I don't use that mic? We good? All right, we're good. Happy Friday to everyone. Happy Friday. So much energy, in Santa Cruz right now. I've been here about 9 years, and it's amazing to see the growth that's going on in Santa Cruz. So it's an honor to be here. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm drinking iced tea. I got off a red eye. I'm on about an hour and a half sleep. We've opened up 2 new offices in different countries, and I visited both of them in the last 2 days, and so I'm really excited to be here. But bear with me if I fall asleep halfway through this. It's okay if you do too. So I think what I wanted to start off doing a little bit is really, I want to center us on something, because oftentimes I think technologists talk about technology and its features and all these things, and the human element can be missing. And so what I want to start off with is something that I think is common with all of us. And so I want you to think about your first home. The first home that you bought, maybe with your husband or wife, and you moved your family into. What was that like? What was that experience like? Or maybe you haven't bought a home yet, but you remember, like me, the first home my parents bought. What was, as you eat your dinner or your lunch, what was it like to have your first meals in there? What was it like to have chopsticks with my wife? We were sitting, I remember, in our first home, and we were sitting on the floor and we were eating Chinese food, and you start building these memories, right? The first memory I have of my first home was actually my parents' first home. It was 800 square feet. It looked about like this. I think this was one of the neighbors' homes. And it was in a small little town called Stockton. And it's not a terribly great town. I feel very blessed that I live in Santa Cruz now. But, it was, in a lot of ways, the American dream for my family. My mother's side of the family is an immigrant family. They came over shortly before I was born. My father was a bricklayer. He never finished high school, but he worked like many people in the blue-collar industries, worked his whole life very, very hard. And so when they bought their first home, there was elation, excitement, trepidation. What's next? There's a big mortgage. It's all these things, right? And for 20 years, they lived in this home. Okay, they built memories in this home. They, had fights in the home. They had beautiful people come over and communion in the home and broke bread in the home, right? And and I think in a lot of ways, our homes are like about as core, as central as a thing as our lives, right? And so, about, 10 years into the home, I got to go off to college, and I was involved in a startup, and the startup did fairly well. We went from a few dozen people to a few thousand people, and it was a really fun ride, and it was the beginning of my tech journey. So I left Stockton, and I've been gone for, a good 10 years or so. And, while I was gone, life had been pretty good. In fact, after the startup, I'd gotten to take some time off and go on a sabbatical and sail around the world and go see all kinds of places that didn't look like Stockton, which is pretty cool. And so I wasn't living in Stockton anymore, but I remember this moment that I would say changed my life. And it was a morning in 2008. It was a Saturday morning, and I was sitting in a pretty comfortable bed in a pretty comfortable place. And I got a call from my mom. And tragedy had hit that morning. And, it sort of was this crux where tragedy had hit our family, and I had to really, stop sort of everything I was doing in life. And, what was interesting about that moment was while there was personal tragedy going on, one of the other things that was going on at this time was a tragedy of, I would say, grander scale. Anybody remember what happened in 2008? We just shouted out. Yeah. There was a financial crisis going on. So, financial crisis was going on. In fact, people were calling it a crisis, and definitely a crisis indeed it was, right? Banks were failing. And in fact, I think in the 2-year period, more banks had failed, and 10 times more banks had failed in that 2-year period than any time in the previous 5 years. So there was sort of a snowballing effect happening. And so while this was going on, my mother was sort of readjusting to a new set of life and a new set of rules. And as the single income earner was no longer in the house, that had clearly a big effect. And so a few months into that process, my mother lost the home that they had built all of the memories in. And my mother was just one of many, many stories, right? In fact, it turns out that there's about 7 million people that in that window lost their homes, okay? And, it's been 10 years since that time happened. And so it's sort of hard to remember, I think, the visceralness. But I was actually in New York at the time, and I remember flying back home in New York. And there was like palpable anger in the air. And I think actually some of it was in Santa Cruz, but in New York there was almost rioting in the streets. Like there were like large groups of people that were like showing up in parks, right? And there were, this growing movement that the institutions had let us down. This growing kind of feeling that somewhere, somehow, the sort of comfortable things, like as simple as an American dream of buying your first home, those institutions we trust, they'd let us down. And I think in some ways, 10 years from now, we forget what that feeling was like. Society moves on very quickly, but it was real. And one of the things I want to talk about today is the results of things like that. The result of what happens when people are frustrated, when they're angry, when they feel let down. And even though that society has gone back to normal, it's been since 10 years. Occupiers have gone home for the most part. The economy is good for the most part. I think oftentimes seeds of change come out of these places. And so what I want to spend the rest of the time talking to you a little bit about is the seeds of change that I believe came out of those moments. The seed of change that I think came out of the moment when the institutions let us down. So, Einstein said this: imagination is more important than knowledge. For knowledge is limited, whereas imagination embraces the entire world, stimulating progress and giving birth to evolution. So, what's happened in the 10 years? Well, let me first tell you a little bit about what's happened in me and kind of my story. Life's moved on. Things are good. I moved to Santa Cruz. Here I am. I've been here about 5 years now, I guess. And one of the things I love about Santa Cruz is it's this place where imagination and creativity, and yes, even the counterculture comes together. At first, I thought it was kind of interesting that the logo when I first moved here was that hand thing with the dude who seems really angry. The screaming hand. Sorry, yeah. Sorry, locals. Screaming hand. I think what's interesting about the mixing here, right, is you have a beautiful place. You have a place that's close to the tech ecosystem. You have creatives. You have hipsters. But then the counterculture mix is actually an important and real one to it. It makes a pretty unique, I think, environment in this town. And so I decided with my wife that we were going to set up shop here, and so we started this company called Paystand. And I don't want to talk too much about it, but just to give you a little bit of context, it's the probably the fastest or one of the fastest growing companies in Santa Cruz right now. We've raised over $10 million in venture capital from the top tier venture capitalists in the world. We're doing about $1 million in GMV right now, and we're probably on track to do $1 billion within the next 12 months. We're hiring people as fast as we can, both from over the hill, moving them back here, as well as here. And you know, the dirty little secret, it's not a dirty secret at all, is the company is a really boring company. It's pretty bad. I mean, here's the thing, we do B2B payments. You know, payments can be kind of cool, like if you picture Venmo, or if you're older in the room, I guess PayPal. You should use Venmo, anyway. But we do that same thing, but for unsexy commercial transactions, which means large companies, the accounts receivable and accounts payable departments need to move money back and forth. Okay, and today it's amazing. They do that mostly through paper checks and wires. And in fact, probably 70% of all payments in some way and shape in the US are still done through paper checks, which, here's a factoid, paper checks were actually designed and first invented about 2,000 years ago. And in fact, they became the most popular form of money movement in the Middle Ages. And then wires, which is the other half, is something most people kind of are familiar with from the 1800s. It was a way to be able to send back and forth when we had trains and we had no way to actually easily communicate with people. And so paper checks and wires are what most big businesses use, and it hasn't changed much. And so our company basically focuses on doing digital transformation in that space. Super boring. Now, what I want to talk to you about, because I hope this is applicable for not only what I'm doing and what other people are doing, but like, why do I believe companies grow fast? Why do I believe companies can have big impact? And I believe the reason is because the best companies hopefully are doing something that's bigger than themselves. I believe that the best companies are a part of a movement that in many ways rises all tides together. That they look at innovation and say, we can imagine the world not as it is, but as it ought to be. And so our company is, as boring as what we're working on is part of a bigger innovation that came out of that 2008 moment, and it's called the blockchain. Now, I want to pause there because there's lots of kind of like hype in the world right now, in the tech world. How many of you can answer a question that we ask every one of our new employees? And in fact, about 80% of them actually can't answer this, so it's okay. Can you answer what is the blockchain and why does it matter? You ready? Actually, 1, 2, 3, that's more than I expected. 5, 6, that's actually very cool. And that's okay, because honestly, we're hiring the best engineers in the world, you know, and very few people can answer that. Now, how many of you are either a business owner, an entrepreneur, work in the creative industry, or work for a startup?
Yeah. Most of you.
Okay. For the record, it's most of you. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about calling, because I do believe that if you are in one of those industries or those fields, you are doing the work, not because you can make a lot of money, not because it's cool, but because you believe passionately in what you do. You wouldn't take on the field or the industry you do. You wouldn't work in a creative field. You wouldn't work in a startup. You wouldn't work in a technology business if you didn't believe that you were doing something that impacted more than just a bottom line. I call it calling. I think it's something that all folks that are creative have a desire to do, have purpose and meaning. Now, every once in a while, I think the things that we have like desire for impact collect together into a pattern. And that pattern starts to collate into something that I think has meaning. And You know, if you're anything like me, you look at those patterns in history and you go, boy, I wish I was part of that. I wish I was there at the moment that the Wright brothers flew for the first time. What would it feel like? What would it be like? The moment that first flight was like. What was it look like in the early days of the airline industry? The first man on the moon, right? What did it feel like? What was it like? Right? These sort of transformational moments in human history. More recently, the internet. You know, I was lucky enough to be part of the very tail end of the internet sort of revolution in the 90s, right when I got involved with startups. But I always wonder, what was it like to be there at the early 90s, the mid 90s, where something as simple as an online bookstore could become this giant thing that just crushes industries, right? It's an online bookstore. But it was part of something bigger, right? It was part of a bigger society change, a bigger moment where how we do things was transformationally moved. So, one of the guys that I respect a lot in the Valley is this guy named Paul Brown. And what he looks for when he's invested in some of the best companies in the world, and one of the things he says what he looks for when he invests in companies, he said, effectively, go find where the hackers and the engineers are spending their time. Where the hackers and the engineers are spending their time, not where they're paid for, but what they're doing on the nights and the weekends, what they're working on because they want to work on it, because they believe in working on it. That's where you will find the next big trends in history. That's where you will find the next big future bets. And for somebody like Paul, that's where you spend the time investing. Now, there's a lot of really cool things going on right now. There's AI, there's driverless cars, there's rocket ships. They're all really cool. But here's the thing. If you poll most engineers, most hackers, most technologists, regardless if they work at Google or they work at Amazon, the thing that they are most interested in spending their time on right now, the thing that they spend their nights and weekends on the side projects that they work on, the thing that they are wondering what the heck it is this crazy thing called the blockchain. So, what is the blockchain? Blockchain is this super, also boring concept. It's a distributed ledger. Now, that can't be world-changing, can't be revolutionary. Ledgers are what we use in our checkbooks to keep track of stuff. Ledgers are what we use for spreadsheets to do jobs that nobody really enjoys doing, just put data and look it around, right? How can a distributed ledger be world-changing? Well, it turns out that the ledgers are effectively what we use to keep track of nearly everything in the economy. Ledgers are how banks keep track of the money that goes back and forth. Ledgers are how we keep track of who owns what houses. Ledgers are what we use to keep track of which car do you own. Ledgers are what we use to keep track of your insurance. Ledgers are what we use to keep track of every important, critical piece of data in society today. Today, those ledgers are basically owned by companies. They're owned by the DMV. They're owned by the top 5 banks. They're owned by insurance companies. They're owned. Our information is owned. And what the distributed ledger means is it's a place where information can be shared publicly for public good, and the information no longer has to be owned by a single company, corporation, or individual. Now, that means a bunch of things, and it's pretty hard to wrap your head around. The thing that most people talk about today is this crazy thing called Bitcoin or cryptocurrency. Now, money is one way to think about a ledger, and it's one of the things that affects us the most. And so money is an interesting application because, again, people have been frustrated with institutions, and so they've said, hey, if there was a way to be able to keep money, send money, store money, move money in a way that didn't rely on governments or banks or institutions, that could be interesting. And they're true. They're right. It could be interesting. And in fact, there is a fast approaching $1 trillion industry that's focused on it. And I'm happy to talk about it and opine on it, but I actually just think that that's one application involved in something much, much bigger. Beyond money, there's a ton of other things that you could work on. Because what the property and the technology does is it opens up the way we share information. It opens up the way we store information, and it's as foundational as the internet itself. It's just like the concepts of a free, open internet, but now applied to all kinds of information. So why does it matter? Well, there's a lot of information you probably don't want owned. And then there's probably a lot of information that having multiple people own it is better than having one person own it. There's also a lot of information that you want more secure. We've all pretty much had our information now hacked and put on the dark web. It's kind of scary to think, but effectively every credit transaction that's ever gone through Equifax or some credit card company or some otherwise is pretty easily bought on the dark web for usually less than $1. And that's not terribly good because it means that people can steal our identities. It means that people can create fraud. And quite honestly, all of that stuff costs our economy a lot. There's also this kind of issue of transparency, right? So information that is not readily available can be packaged in ways that can be corrupted. Governments and companies can use them in bad ways. And so transparency in general, we've seen in the internet, has been a good thing. Transparency in information is probably a good thing as well. And then there's a new economic model that's getting created out of this thing called the blockchain. They're called tokens, and it's going to take a little bit of time for, I think, the industry to understand what it means, but it means that there are new ways for us to actually create and spend business models. There's new ways for us to actually take companies public. There's new ways for us to be able to pay for things, and they can be entirely democratized and they can be entirely shared. So I know a lot of that is like super ephemeral, and so most people go, whatever, right? And it's totally okay. Like the last bit of stuff is like all the things that technologists talk about and spout, but nobody understands it. So what I actually want to do to make this real is talk a little bit about that 800 square foot house. So how the 800 square foot house that my family bought gets bought today, and you probably have bought your home like this, right? First you go to a agent, and when you decide you're going to buy a house, and you have like a ton of paperwork, right? Like nobody reads it. Does anybody read anything in there? So of course you don't read it, right? So what do? You actually use different companies that you sort of semi-trust, maybe because they have brand or whatever, and you say, well, I don't know what any of this does, but you do. You, the real estate agent, you, the title company, okay? You, the escrow company, you, the property owner, you, the records back at government, right? I don't know what any of this means, but maybe you do. That's what we're going to pay you to do. So we have built, when we bought that 800 square foot house, we built a whole cottage industry, like layers and layers and layers of people to say, I don't know what any of this is, but we trust that you do. And that's not a bad thing, in fact, because when I'm buying the house, there's a whole bunch of records, right? There's, did I get insurance on it? Who owned the house? What was the record of the house? Were there any major damages or failures that happened? Who built it? When was it built? Like, all of these things are important to know because they go into the price of the house. And we need to trust it. So in absence of trusting the person that sold the house, who may or may not know it too, we rely on the middleman. Now, the middlemen, they do their best, but the reality is the information is oftentimes inaccurate. Or what's worse is in, not America, but in other countries, that information can actually be altered, right? It's some of the single largest problems for economic growth in places like Honduras, in Africa, is what happens if somebody changes the title. Somebody who once owned the house no longer has owned the house anymore. That information is so critical. So what the blockchain does is it's a single source of truth that not just the real estate company owns, or the title company owns, or the insurance company owns, right? It's it's a place where records that we all have a public good to share could share. It doesn't mean it's open, out in the open. It doesn't mean that anybody can steal the information. In fact, it's the most mathematically secure set of information that we've invented. It has not ever been hacked. And it would be very hard to hack this information. And it uses something called immutability. Now, immutability is a mathematical engineering term, but it effectively means that a record cannot be changed or destroyed. Now, again, why is that important? It seems like a very small thing. The reason why it's important is because you don't want a fraud person to come in and change it. You don't want somebody to remove a record and destroy it. So, something as simple as an open, decentralized, shared database can affect as big of an industry as real estate and title. It could mean that the housing that we buy and sell and share could be more efficient. And here's the thing. Remember my story about 2008? Well, it turns out there's a lot of reasons why people believe, I did my thesis, master's thesis on this, and there's a lot of reasons why the 2008 financial crisis happened. But one of them is because banks aren't bad. Like, banks have humans, and humans do their best. And so what happened is that people didn't understand the risk that actually those houses, those distressed houses, actually had. There was so much packaging of bad assets. The banks took those bad assets and then packaged them again, and then sold them again, and they sold them again, and they sold them again. And so we had bad information sitting at the bottom, right? And then it just got packaged, until the point was there was a house of cards, okay? Now, one of many possible use cases is that kind of information can be more transparent. It can be open. It can be understood. So we don't build our information in our world on a house of cards. Now that's real estate, it's title, but it turns out that's just the beginning. This stuff matters all over society. I was just 2 days ago, I was with some of the largest auto manufacturers in the world. I was with representatives from the DMV. I was with representatives from insurance. And we were talking about this issue about transfer of car ownership. It's like a pretty small, simple thing. But it turns out it's just a huge problem because why? Well, if a manufacturer has a recall, and there's something highly dangerous with the car, and then you sold your car, the manufacturer no longer knows who owns the car. The DMV doesn't update the manufacturer. The insurance person has no idea what the background of the car is, or they have, at best, models around it. And so the end user that gets the car the second time over may or may not actually know if there's something highly critical that they need to fix on their car that the manufacturer is willing to pay for. And the insurance company wants you to do it so you don't get in a wreck and hurt people and then cause all kinds of other economic downsides, right? So, turns out this boring, decentralized thing called a distributed ledger is perfect. Because, why? You have multiple stakeholders. It's for the public good, one single place. lowers the cost, drives transparency, and not one person owns it. All of a sudden now, your records aren't just owned by the insurance company or the manufacturers to package it up and sell it and then make money on ad dollars and then go to Congress and try to make good that your ad dollars are actually, it's okay and selling information's okay. No, it's like the internet. The goal is for it to be a public good, right? Insurance, healthcare, right? We all know how difficult it is to go from one healthcare organization to another, and we don't have a single way to be able to move our healthcare records. Right? Why? Because, again, it's not that any of these industries are corrupt, it's just the institutions get big, and then the question becomes, how do they talk to each other? When there's a public good or a public benefit, how do they actually interact? So these are the sorts of things that the blockchain actually can solve. So this is just the very beginning, and I think what I wanted to leave you with is like, what kinds of things could you do with this, right? And I think what I would say is the stage you're in right now is like the internet in the 90s. And I think that's pretty exciting because you're in the beginning of a historic moment where you will look back and you will say, this actually transformed society. And so there's a bunch of things maybe you would have done in the internet in 1995. One of them is just supporting it. So crypto technology and cryptocurrency in general, I think, has got some bad stuff to it, but it's got some good stuff to it. But it's one way that you can sort of start to get your feet in this industry. You can start kind of looking at it because it's a way everybody can take part in it. It's a way you can move money back and forth if you're sending money cross-border. It's a way that you could maybe, at a very, very high risk way, that you can look at investing, because in some ways it's being treated as digital gold. You can support companies and initiatives that are blockchain based, because I think a lot of companies in my industry right now in technology have a choice. They can sort of build things the way Facebook and Google and Amazon and other folks built them, or they can build it on this. And if they build it on this, some of them will be boring, unsexy companies like our company. But all of them are hopefully building towards a better technology that's more open, transparent, right, and efficient. So you can support those companies. One last plug I'll do is we have a tool for small businesses that's entirely free, and it's just a really easy way for companies to pay their bills. So instead of using a checkbook, instead of using a bank's kind of clunky interface, we just give it away for free. And so any business can use it right now. They can use the control, the security, the automation to be able to make it so they can pay their bills much, much easier. And there's lots of companies like us that are doing really interesting things in a lot of the industries that I'm talking about. And then what I would say is, if you are an entrepreneur or a technologist or working at a startup company or a creative, which most of you raised your hand and said you are, I would say do things that matter. Too many times, I think, over the hill right now, companies are working on things that don't matter. They're working on, autonomously getting it so my Chinese food gets to me faster. That's okay. If you're going to choose something to spend your blood, sweat, and tears on, I would suggest do it in something that actually is making a larger impact. Go join a startup or technology company that's working on this stuff. Go start a company that's working on this stuff. Go tell people about it that's working on stuff. Because in a small way, it could actually make an impact. The work you do actually could be part of something that's bigger. So, what I want to leave you with is, back in 2009, after I was sort of dealing with the aftermath of my family's tragedy, with my mom, who was sort of trying to figure out what post-life was in an empty home and then a new home. And so when I went back to New York, I remember I was pretty upset myself. Grieving is one of those things. And so I did something. It's the only time in my life I've done it. I went down to where people were picketing, and I looked around and I said, yeah, I think I'll get a sign. I think I'll shake my hand. I think I'll get angry. And then I saw a sign that was just about like this. And it said, stand for nothing, you'll fall for anything. And I thought, well, right now in 2009, I know what I'm angry about. I know what I stand against. But what do I stand for? What do I want to see the world look like? What do I believe in? It's easy to stand against something. It's a lot harder to look and say, what should the world look like? So in that moment, I left, and I went back to do grad school. And so I thought, boy, I wanted to be an astronaut when I grew up. I did not think I'd do finance. But I was pretty upset about it. And so I thought, I'm going to go back and do my grad school and think about it. And it was there that I sort of fell in love when I discovered way back before people are talking about blockchain now, 5 years ago, that it sort of reignited in me the magic of entrepreneurship, the magic of what we all do, the magic of startups and the magic of technology, right, is to imagine what if. Imagine what if, and small thing, what if it became something big? What if what we do mattered? What if the technology we worked on could make the world more fair and equitable? What if we could democratize systems that too long power structures and institutions have held? What if we could open up the world in more interesting ways? What if we could tear down walls and industries and think about them as they ought to be or they could be? We've democratized so much. We've democratized governments. We roundly say how important the Western world is because it's not one person, but many. We've democratized communication. We say roundly how important it is now that anyone has a voice. What's the next evolution of democracy? I would suggest it's the blockchain. Thank you very much. I hope you join me in learning more.
Yeah.